JBS viewers, welcome to the ISGAP Hour. I'm David Harris, Executive Vice Chair of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which we lovingly call ISGAP. And as always, I'm joined by the visionary founder and CEO of ISGAP, Dr. Charles Small. Hi, Charles.
Hi, how you doing? Good to see you.
We've got a great guest, and we're going to give a lot of this hour to that guest. But first, I want to ask you one simple question, so to speak. You've got a lot in your mind, a lot of worries, a lot of tourists when it comes to the issues we're dealing with. But if you had to choose one issue above all that keeps you up at night and that you wish from the rooftops you could scream and wake up every American, every Canadian, what would that issue be?
It's a great question. I think there's many. I think we have to start at home. I think the American Jewish community in particular really needs to understand that we're dealing with systemic problems of anti-Semitism. This is a very, perhaps, pivotal moment.
So systemic, not episodic. I mean, it's not going to come and go.
No, this is going to be around for a while because our education system has been corrupted. Education system, our higher education institutions are places where young Americans are learning to be citizens and now for decades have been misinformed when it comes about democracy, about Israel and the Jewish people. So this is now systemic anti-Semitism. And at the same time, our community has to be proud of who we are. We have to reconnect to our wisdom and understand who we are and the ethics of seeing ourselves, perceiving ourselves, and our connection to Israel, and the ethics of working with other people, other Americans, and defending democracy. Our Jewish organizations, I think, have to be really engaged and understand that we're fighting systemic anti-Semitism, and we're fighting for the life of our democratic principles. Thomas Jefferson said, every generation we have to renew our democratic principles and institutions. And now's the time to fight against anti-Semitism, which is a manifestation of anti-democratic principles, and to reinforce democracy and reinforce our community and stand proud, defend our students on campus, defend our communities, and defend our democracy.
And within that, ISGAP can't take it all on. So what on the ISGAP agenda is at the top of the list right now?
So we're fighting anti-Semitism in education and academia. We're looking at the corruption of how the Muslim Brotherhood through
And you're not
Qatar.
looking just at the symptoms. You're looking at the root causes,
Correct.
which distinguishes ISGAP from other Jewish or other institutions,
Indeed.
Jewish and not.
Yeah, indeed. So we're looking at how universities are taking funds from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Qatari regime, which is not only anti-Semitic, it's anti-American. So we're fighting anti-Semitism at that level. And I think through education, through our policy work, we're taking our findings to Washington. We've brought our findings to over 140 congressional leaders, over 50 senators in different committees. So Washington now knows about our work.
And we're beginning to see it's making a difference.
Absolutely.
It's changing the discourse in Washington.
Absolutely.
And we're going to have to come back to this, of course, again and again on the ISGAP Hour show, Charles. But we want to give as much time as we can to our very special guest.
Thanks, David. Thanks. We're honored to have Sam Katz with us today. Sam actually works with ISGAP on our Follow the Money project. But Sam is a very well-known intellectual and writer on issues of counterterrorism and security issues. He's written many books in this subject matter, including on the Middle East, on Jordan. He's writing an important book now about Meir Dagan and some of his activities when he was the head of Mossad. So it's really an honor that you're here. And Sam is also published widely in magazines like Esquire and GQ and other top journals around the world. So Sam, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it. So Sam, as an expert on issues of security and policing, I know that you and I have been discussing for many years now the threat of anti-Semitism, not just in the classroom and on encampments, but the threat to American society and stability as a whole. For the viewers, can you please sort of lay out your concerns and why this is an issue for not just for ISGAP, but I think you feel for NYPD and other police forces in American cities?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, what emanated out of the classroom has now become mainstream. And it became mainstream for years, but it was fueled and injected with high power octane after October 7th, when all of a sudden, all of the hatred that had been pent up for years emerged, and it emerged of all places where people are supposed to be enlightened and supposed to know the difference between homicide and heinous acts and civil disobedience and political discourse. And when this rage became mainstream, it was allowed to expand. It became a trend. Anti-Semitism on campus developed its own paraphernalia. The keffiyeh became the popular go-to accoutrement that people would wear and belong to something. And I think that beyond the discussion that we're having on anti-Semitism, and we're looking at universities, we're also looking at people on campuses around the country and around the world who probably spent the last year of their lives in high school and their first year or so at university doing it remotely, where they were completely separated from any interaction with people of their own age. And all of a sudden...
And this is because of COVID, just to be clear.
Because of COVID and the pandemic. And their development, their ability to judge right and wrong was impacted almost completely by social media. That was their only grip on the outside world that they could have. And it becomes addictive, and it becomes very mind-controlling. And when October 7th happened, and there was so much information, so much imaging, and all of a sudden very well organized elements within campuses. And these are discussions that were emanating for years among the academia and the professors. When it came to fruition, they found a cause that not only they could go out and march for, even though they might not understand it, but they could become part of something bigger. And it just so happens that that something bigger is the hatred of Jews, the hatred of Israel, and almost a very rage-filled middle finger in Western society. Western society, as they look at it, failed them, or failed the narrative that they have been fed. And now they're protesting. And the protesting has gone beyond chants. It has come to takeovers. It has come to acts of great inconvenience and violence and destruction. And it can only get worse.
So Sam, you started your comments by saying, from the classroom. And at ISGAP, the scholars, and I think scholars are often maligned in society, not taken so seriously at times in the general population. But for decades, scholars who care about anti-Semitism and care about democratic principles have been warning the Jewish community, have been warning society as a whole that there's something rotten in our best universities, that there are young Americans who go to universities to learn how to become citizens are learning horrible things about Israel, about Zionism, and about Jews, and even democracy in the best universities in our country. And you said it goes from the classroom to the encampment to the society. Can you expand on how ideas matter and how they impact the situation that we're in today?
Well, when you've worked for 4 years as a student in high school to get into a good university, when your parents have taken on second and third jobs or taken a second mortgage on their home to get you in that A-level elite higher education institution, the people who teach you there are beyond just teachers. They are inspirations. They're supposed to guide you for the rest of your life. They're supposed to prepare you for success. And when these individuals impart upon their students a very different view of the world than is real, is in step with Western values, it changes the narrative in the mind of individuals. And part of the issue, as I see it, is almost the correlation, you could say, between how news has changed in the country, because I think they're connected. News used to be an element of the three major networks that was not supposed to make money. It was supposed to report the news. And if we look at the history of journalism in this country, we had Walter Cronkite's and so forth, where there might be a political slant, but there was investigative reports, there was insightful analysis of what was happening. News then became a business, and news divisions were supposed to turn a profit. And as a result, the narrative had to become more provocative, more challenging in questioning of reality, and more to make a story interesting, exciting, so that more viewers would be attracted, so that advertising revenue would be increased. And here we have the situation that, when combined with the universities, creates a whole new way how news, the world outside the dorm room, is shaped for university students.
Sam, you said in your opening remarks, used the term well organized. After October 7th, what we saw, was it principally spontaneous reactions to unforeseen or unforeseeable events? Or was there in fact something well organized, and what were you referring to when you used the term well organized?
Well, the seeds had been planted long ago, and the fruit had been sitting in a warehouse in people's minds for years. But if you look at October 7th, and you look 24 hours after, there was a protest, a large protest in Times Square by pro-Hamas elements. And these elements already had stickers and T-shirts showing men with weapons on hang gliders. Less than 24 hours after the attacks in Israel. That takes money, that takes effort, that takes an infrastructure. And that infrastructure doesn't stem from a spontaneous act or the will to protest. These groups were organized, they were well in place. They had time for years to gain legitimacy. And once groups on university campuses or elsewhere gain legitimacy, then it's much harder to knock them down. It's much harder to argue that they don't have a valid point and a valid point for being on the streets of America executing their First Amendment rights. And that's the danger.
And because you focus all of your work on national security and counterterrorism, were the authorities, including law enforcement in this country, aware and watching? Or were they somehow dismissive, indifferent to this increasingly well-oiled machine? Because what you said about Times Square, strikingly, the same T-shirts, the same slogans, the same banners appeared at Harvard University and elsewhere in the country. Could this all have been just randomly, by chance?
No. Right after 9/11, law enforcement became proactive in investigating organized terror groups. Then the focus was primarily on Al-Qaeda. But even before 9/11, there were attempts by terrorist groups or people affiliated with terrorist groups to perpetrate acts of terror on the United States, on the streets of America.
By the way, including the World Trade Center in 1993.
The World Trade Center in 1993. I wrote a book about a plot by two Palestinians in 1997 to blow up the subway line from Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. That was thwarted by chance.
What was the name of the book for readers?
Jihad in Brooklyn.
Jihad in Brooklyn.
It was 4 years after the bombing of the World Trade Center and 4 years before 9/11. And after 9/11, law enforcement began to focus on intelligence, looking who the players were. The NYPD was incredibly proactive in not only bringing in people from the CIA to run their intelligence division, but sending officers overseas to the Middle East, to Europe, to as far as Singapore, to learn, to see, to hear, and to report back what might come to the streets of America. The war on terror ended when other elements of our society became more pronounced. COVID, for example. And the ability to monitor these groups, the ability to understand what they stood for and their entrenchment in the United States sort of fell to if by chance. And there is nothing if by chance when combating terrorism. It's cliche, but law enforcement always says that we have to be right all the time, the terrorists only have to be right once. Well, a lot of groups that are designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the State Department have sort of been allowed to slide into the mainstream. Representatives of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, for example, have had emissaries, had some of their most famous terrorists appear on college campuses, at some of the better schools, to speak. Now, The PFLP, for people who aren't familiar with, is the group that inaugurated air piracy. In 1972, the group was responsible for the murder of 17 U.S. citizens, Puerto Rican pilgrims, at Lod Airport in Israel. It's a group that's still designated as a foreign terrorist organization, but still people were issued visas to come here. So once the paradigm has shifted, where violent players are now part of the discourse, there's no reason to really place a focused eye on what these groups are and what they could perpetrate here, and how well organized they might be through splinter groups, through charitable organizations, and other elements that camouflage their appearance and existence.
But if the government, law enforcement, under whichever party, kind of lost the plot after a certain period or dropped the plot, and if universities themselves were not only not watching, but in some cases complicit, Charles, something you've been talking about for many years, what about the role of Jewish organizations? Did they try to fill the vacuum, this space, in order to monitor what was going on, this emerging threat?
Monitoring something and action are two different things. I'm always struck by Israel and the Jewish community, the lack of messaging, the lack of cohesive and effective messaging in raising the alarms to this danger. I'm always struck by how the startup nation can't find someone to stand up and speak for itself and explain its position, both before October 7th and after. And I think that many Jewish organizations hoped that the problem would simply disappear. And I'll raise an issue that I scream about as someone who spent 40 years in communications and messaging. There was an advertisement about anti-Semitism that appeared of a mother and her daughter leaving their home, and they find a swastika painted on their white garage door. The mother shields the daughter's head, goes in her car, the neighbor sees this, and then paints over it. The mother looks at the neighbor, there's paint on his shoes, and she says, "Thank you." The painting of a swastika on the home of a Jew or anybody is a crime. There are local statutes, there are state statutes, and there are federal statutes. It's a hate crime. So what the ad basically did was say, don't look, don't tell. It'll go away. When the ad should have messaged, when the mother returns, there's tons of law enforcement out there with lights and sirens doing an investigation and bringing the perpetrator to justice and explaining that the price for hate, the price for action, the price for terror will be steep. It will result in criminal prosecution and civil liabilities. And I think that message still has not been sounded from the highest mountain that Jewish organizations could.
So if you could be conductor of the Jewish Symphony Orchestra for a day with your baton.
I think I'm the last person in the world you'd want to have to do that.
But you're our honored guest. We have the audience of JBS viewers. Okay, we can't undo what happened yesterday, the day before, but we can try and learn and plan for tomorrow and the day after. So let's move from description to prescription for a moment. Given what you see, your very unique perspective, and this confluence of both the Jewish, the national, and the global, what should be the agenda, the priority items for Jewish organizations today? And obviously, because you're connected to ISGAP, where exactly does ISGAP fit into that picture?
First of all, what's happening today should be identified as criminal activity, first and foremost.
Let's be clear, what's criminal activity? Is protesting as an encampment at Columbia? Some would say...
Trespassing is a crime. Denying Jewish students their civil rights is a crime. Harassing violently, threatening is a crime. Disrupting hubs of transportation, blocking entrances to airports or train stations is a crime. Politics has gotten in the way of enforcing this, where people are receiving no bail tickets and are not really facing the consequences, but it's a crime. and it's a crime that needs to be handled efficiently, quickly, and decisively by law enforcement. And I think that Jewish groups must sound the alarm that these are crimes. These aren't issues that universities will handle on their own, because they won't. They haven't. These are crimes that target a specific group of people in this country, a group of people that have been persecuted for centuries, a group of people, many of whom have found safe haven in the United States because of what the United States stands for. And they should not be subjected to threats, violence, and acts of hate that no other group would tolerate. I wonder what if the encampment at Columbia was against African Americans, and there was a group that was raising nooses promising to lynch African Americans to trees. But that same hate-filled rhetoric was evident on all the campuses where there were trouble. And Jewish students feared for their lives. Now, there's a whole list of civil action that Jewish groups can take, and I wish they would take it, to take to court to seek damages on behalf of Jewish students, on behalf of individuals inconvenienced by illegal protests, that will keep the other groups, the organized groups that we mentioned earlier, in court for the next 200 years. But that requires pro-action, and I'm not sure that that's in the stomach of many who just want this somehow to go away.
Charles.
Very well said, Sam. As you're speaking, in my mind, I'm thinking of Iran. The revolutionaries in Iran focused on universities because they knew if you change the minds of people, this will impact society. As in our work, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and the funding by Qatar to universities, where the Qataris represent the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a small country of less than 350,000 citizens, and they're giving tens of billions of dollars that we found, and I'm sure there's much more, to our top universities, influencing education in perhaps the most sensitive institution in our democracy. This is where young citizens learn to be citizens. Given you were talking about how the media has been kind of transformed into, the news has been transformed into a money-making venture as opposed to reporting things. I think universities also have become much more invested in making money and receiving money from all places, including spaces that are anti-liberal education, anti-Semitic, sexist, homophobic, anti-American, anti-democratic. And you were talking about the police force. How do we get the police to intervene and make this, intervene into the criminal activities, which they're not? Why are they not engaged? Is there political leaders that are stopping the police from enforcing the law? How do we transform this inaction into the police defending our laws and defending our way of life?
It's partly political. It's partly, I think, because universities have become money magnets for donations from this country, from alumni, as well as from overseas. It's best to keep all the dirty business behind closed doors. And the last thing that Columbia wanted back months ago was to have the NYPD's emergency service unit storm the hall where the students had barricaded themselves. It generates incredibly negative press. And it tells alumni not to send in their donations. And university presidents, people who are in charge, have to understand that there's liability involved, and that they face enormous civil liability if people are harmed, education that's halted, tuition money that's wasted, and political leaders have to come to a brave decision and say a university president cannot say that what happens behind these gates is separate from the laws of this city, the laws of this state, or the laws of this country.
So how do we move this in New York? Is it the Trump administration now is going to start putting the appropriate pressure? Or does it also have to come from the local level?
I think that by denying funding on a federal level, it raises awareness in the university level that, oh my God, something bad is happening. Because the last thing that a business wants is for its revenue to dry up. And it requires courage. It requires a lot of determined, coordinated effort by groups, by politicians, and by law enforcement administrators. It's very damning in this day and age when every protester on campus not only has a placard that says from river to the sea, also has a keffiyeh, but also has a smartphone that is taking pictures of law enforcement. And it's almost sport to go the police officers into a violent confrontation, because then that person who is striking an officer, spitting on him or cursing him, will become a hero, a martyr. Will have his Andy Warhol 15 seconds of fame, 15 minutes of fame. And officers are restrained by the limits of social media. Their actions are restrained. And I don't think that officers, unless they're indemnified by their departments or by state government, want to risk their pensions in enforcing the law wholeheartely the way years ago it might have been.
I'll just say very briefly, the ISGAP team has been spending time in Washington. We have a wonderful legal team there, and we've been meeting with leaders speaking about illegal funding coming to the United States and trying to thwart that, but also pushing the idea of Title VI, that there can't be discrimination at universities, which are very obvious now. And we've been pushing the federal government to do something, and we're quite satisfied that things are beginning to move. It's a good beginning. When we were speaking off camera, you were also mentioning that the student leader who's now arrested and threatened with deportation, you were concerned. I think you were pleased that he was arrested, but you're also concerned that he may become sort of a martyr to this sort of movement on the streets of New York. Could you expand on that, please?
Well, I don't know the legalities of what he was arrested for, other than violation, according to what I've read of his visa, of his green card. There are laws in this country that providing material support to designated terrorist groups is a felony, federal offense. And providing propaganda, providing momentum to promote a terror group such designated by the State Department must be part of every U.S. attorney's repertoire of going after these individuals. Yes, you can say that there should be a Palestinian state. Yes, you can protest. But when you advocate on behalf of a group that has murdered American citizens, that is still holding American citizens, that has been identified by the U.S. government for years, Republican and Democratic administrations alike, as a terrorist group, you are providing support for that group. And it's not only Hamas. There have been headbands seen and support for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
And Hezbollah.
And Hezbollah. Hezbollah before 9/11 killed more Americans than any other terror group out there.
And by the way, for viewers, if I'm correct, and if I'm not, Sam, you'll tell me, Hamas and Hezbollah were designated as foreign terrorist organizations in the United States during the Clinton administration.
Correct.
In other words, by a Democratic administration, which prompts this question: why are we increasingly seeing a partisan divide, at least it appears to me, rather than a kind of perfect issue for unity around what we're talking about?
Well, that's $1 million question. The narrative was lost some time ago as to who would be the best advocates for Israel and the Jewish people, and who would support the other side. And somewhere along the lines, it became a red state, blue state issue, when it should never have.
So what went wrong, I guess, is what I'm asking. We took such pride, and I speak from the bosom of the Jewish community where I worked for nearly 50 years. We took great pride in the bipartisan nature of the U.S.-Israel alliance and the bipartisan nature of support for the American Jewish community as an integral part of the United States. And now before our eyes, we're seeing the beginning of a breakdown without any certainty that it can be repaired. What happened in your analytical view?
I think there was a decision that happened. It wasn't a dedicated decision, but the evangelicals became the great promoter of Israel in the United States. And it alienated the view of how many in the left and progressive side of the House looked at the issue. It also became an issue where social media helped push a narrative that Israel was a European colonial power and that the Palestinians were victims of this colonialism. Whereas in reality, Israel is a mosaic of every color known to man, where in a combat unit of the IDF, you can have a Druze officer, a Jewish sergeant, and a Christian soldier.
And if I may add, Sam, to what you just said, and Zionism is perhaps the longest standing and most successful anti-colonial project in human history.
Absolutely. But the narrative, the people who are advocating on behalf of Israel fit a certain appearance. They fit...
Meaning?
They tend to look like the people that the progressives are arguing that they are.
Aging white males.
Aging white males. I didn't want to say
Exhibit A, B, and C.
I didn't want to say it.
Well,
but it's true, and that is, in my view, part of the self-inflicted damage that Israel and the Jewish community has done for years by keeping that flow, keeping those individuals in front of the cameras. When Israel is a many different things, and Israel, if someone would look at it, is a nation that fits just as much a progressive narrative,
absolutely,
than it does a conservative one.
But, Charles, I know you have a question, but can I just slip in
Please,
one thing here? Point well taken. But on October 7th, 251 people were kidnapped, not to mention all those who were murdered. And those kidnapped, whose faces we came to see and know on lamp poles in New York, wherever you looked, were the mosaic that you describe. You had African, Asian, Jewish, non-Jewish, you had Muslim, you had Druze, you had female, you had male, you had children, you had that mosaic you describe, and yet, at least from where I sit, it didn't generate either the understanding, much less the sympathy or the empathy for the fact that Israel is not this white male colonialist project. Israel is the mosaic that you've been talking about.
But if I may, I'm going to interject a bit and push back a bit. I think this is part of the anti-Semitic shift in higher education and in the zeitgeist of our education system and higher education, and now entering into the political system. You said we were 3 white males. I find that interesting. That's the education that young people are getting at the Ivy League universities. But if we take a step back, scholars, professors of eugenics, biology, theology, philosophers...
Demonstrators in Charlottesville, Virginia.
No, let me make my point. The Nazi regime took the best intellectuals and they defined the Jew as not white. And based on racial ideologies, perceived the Jew as poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race, and set into motion a whole process that liquidated the Jews based on race, based on the fact that we were not white and a threat to the white race. Less than 2 generations, Edward Said, Rashid Khalili, all the intellectuals that are in Columbia and other universities, the best universities in the United States and the Western world, are now saying that Jews are white, And it's not that we're white, welcome to the club, and we're sorry for what happened to you. We're white, we're colonizers, we're occupiers, we're supporters of apartheid. And this is the education that is being paid for by the Muslim Brotherhood through Qatar and other sources, and funding the intellectuals that are perpetrating this dehumanizing, demonizing view of Israel, of Zionism, as you said, the most successful anti-colonial movement, and now it's being transformed into an occupying movement, and perceiving the Jews as white supremacist and apartheid supporters. So this is the problem that has permeated deeply into American society, and I dare say, even into the identities, particularly of American Jewish people in the community. It's different in Europe, it's different in Canada, and it's certainly different in Israel. So these ideas are very powerful.
And the reason I mentioned Charlottesville, Charles, as you know, was because we're getting it from both sides.
Yes.
In other words, for the marchers in Charlottesville, the neo-Nazis, Jews will not replace us. Who's the us?
Oh, the progressives.
The us is the Aryan race. For your left-wing progressives, we're the poster children now for the evils of white skin.
Yeah.
Yeah, the progressives don't have the monopoly on anti-Semitism.
No. So, thoughts on these issues?
It's difficult to classify this enormous issue and look at guilty parties because there's so many. And the messaging for Israel and Jews is always different. After October 7th, when the enormity of the event became clear, and it took several days, and the horrors and the kidnapped victims and the stories began to emerge, Israel became the focus of the world. News organizations rushed everyone they could to Israel. But yet the Western powers in particular told Israel, back off,
Right.
think about it, and don't lose your humanity. It's very difficult to retain one's humanity when faced with such brutality and such medieval horror. And I'm always struck by, especially President Biden at the time, when he sort of warned Israel, to do it carefully. Because in 2016, the United States led a coalition that destroyed the city of Mosul to save it. In order to oust ISIS from Mosul, they killed untold thousands in bombing that was relentless, bombing that was carried out by coalition aircraft from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from Qatar, and from Saudi Arabia. It was a global effort against an enemy that was no less horrific than Hamas. But there were different standards. And when different standards are created in the mindset of leaders, either social leaders, political leaders, or whatever, it creates that Jews are on a different plane. And because of that, the way Jews are looked at, the way Israel is looked at, is different than the way other countries are looked at. I'm always struck when you think about the horror of the Bibas family, for example. After 300 girls were kidnapped in Nigeria by Boko Haram, Michelle Obama used her platform to create a campaign, bring them back, bring the girls back. There was no such campaign in the United States by anybody, let alone Jewish organizations, Jewish celebrities.
But again, why could Jewish children be murdered, beheaded, kidnapped? Why could Africans, Asians, Muslims living in Israel be seized, kidnapped, and brutally treated? And none of the comparable groups that profess to worry about those communities were silent. Was Israel the overarching defining term that kind of neutralized everything, silenced everyone? And if so, is there any other explanation for it but raw, unadulterated, Charles, anti-Semitism? What other explanation can there be for the silence around the Bibas children who in a way like Anne Frank for the Shoah, have now become the eternal face of October 7th?
Well, part of it is anti-Semitism, and I always hate to use that as the...
As do I. It's too convenient.
It's the Uncle Leo defense from Seinfeld, where he claims that his burger was undercooked because the cook was anti-Semitic. There are many factors that create a perfect storm. And Israel has allowed itself and has not really figured out a strategy, a geopolitical strategy, to make it align with every other nation on earth. It's always separate. There's always an asterisk next to Israel.
But just to be the devil's advocate, Sam, is it fair to put some of the blame on Israel for the predicament in which it finds itself in messaging and communications?
Yes, the Israeli government is responsible for telling the world what dangers it faces, coordinating with American groups, or coordinating with their partners around the world, and that message wasn't clear.
But would the BBC have reacted differently had there been a different messenger? Would The Guardian, would Sky News, would the New York Times have reacted differently?
The New York Times, you have to put on a separate plane, because there's a segment of the Jewish world that believes the Old and New Testaments are written every day by the editorial board of the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Israel is viewed by many on either side, on every side, as a problem. And that message should never have happened, and that message should be fought against. For years, all of the apartheid talk that was thrown at Israel was unanswered. When people are yelling at you and calling you a racist and saying that you run an apartheid nation, and there is no coordinated effort by anyone on the shores of the Mediterranean or on the shores of the Potomac to do something about it, it'll stick. And it has stuck. And the damage that negligence has allowed is seen on the streets of America and in the campuses of this country.
So again, reverting back to what we said earlier, Sam, we can't undo what was done, but we can plan for today and tomorrow. If you were suddenly advising the Israeli government on this point, well, what should be the strategy?
Well, the strategy, first of all, is to have individuals that represent the government that look like the rest of the country, mm-hmm. and who speak to that, and who aren't afraid to speak the truth. One of the things that Israel did not do right after October 7th was present to the world the case of why we're fighting. What is Hamas? What is the ideology? What do they intend to do? What have they done? There's a whole history of suicide bombings that existed, of cruelty, of kidnapping, of torture, of interactions with Hezbollah, Iran. All of the people on the checklist of evil have been part of the Hamas narrative. And nobody came out and explained to American youth, American decision makers, or the media what exactly Hamas is. Smarter people need to do that, smarter people than me. But during the Second World War, the US military put together films, Why We Fight, so that soldiers going over there would realize that they were in a fight against evil, unadulterated evil, mind-controlled fascist evil of the worst kind that went against every fabric of what made this country exceptional. And we've lost that.
So we now have the tragic irony that perhaps the most regressive political and social cause on the planet, Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, the whole network, has been enthusiastically embraced by the so-called most progressive elements in the country. In other words, diametrically opposed in their value systems and yet fully aligned. How do we get into such a situation?
The insanity of the world that we live in. I mean, it is mind-boggling that you would have on campuses Queers for Palestine advocating on behalf of a group that throws homosexuals off of rooftops. That you would have progressives in Congress, the Squad, fighting on behalf of women, supporting a group that not only renders women as second-class citizens, but engages in rape as a military strategy. That is beyond comprehension. If you pitch this as a Hollywood script to a producer, they'd laugh you out of the business. It's beyond the imagination.
Charles, we just have another moment or two, unfortunately, with Sam Katz. Final questions for this show?
So basically, I think, how would you advise the Jewish community to engage the problems now in our universities and on our streets? What would you mentioned earlier that you think Jewish organizations should start suing universities?
Yes.
Civil suits, legal suits, what would you?
Lawsuits. Multi-billion-dollar lawsuits on behalf of students. The Jewish community, as I see it, especially if you look at a lot of the groups that are marching alongside people with the Hezbollah and Hamas flags, is divided. And I think that the mainstream Jewish groups have to express the hatred that the other side displays and let it be known that the other individuals, while their political beliefs could be as left-wing as possible, that they are marching alongside people who would happily put them in the oven, would happily line them up against the wall and shoot them. This is the insanity of the whole world that we witness on a daily basis. I don't know how that unity is forged. I don't know if that unity can be forged. But it is essential that it be known, that almost shaming individuals, that the people that they're fighting for are people who want to kill them.
And on that note, Charles,
Yeah.
not the most encouraging and upbeat note, but a clear message of responsibility. Sam, New York Times best-selling author of many books, many articles, as you mentioned earlier. I hope, JBS viewers, that you'll look up Samuel Katz and acquire some of his important books. And on behalf of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which we lovingly call ISGAP, on behalf of its visionary founder and director, Dr. Charles Small, and myself, David Harris, thanks for watching the ISGAP Hour, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.